Okay, hello everyone. This lesson is all about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we've been learning about the Cold War. Last week we learned all about the significance of Berlin during the Cold War. In our lesson this week, we are going to focus all about Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, this is all very much linked to the fact that during the Cold War, the Americans and the Soviet Union developed lots of nuclear weapons. And the first thing I want you to think about is, what do we mean by the concept of mutually assured destruction? And you can maybe write down some ideas for this just to help you remember it. So the idea of mutually assured destruction is that if a nuclear war did begin between America and the Soviet Union, because both sides had so many missiles, if the Americans fired a nuclear missile on the Soviet Union would respond. And in the end, if they had a big nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, or the USSR, as it's known as well, then it could lead to huge destruction, millions and millions of people dying, and possibly completely changing or maybe even wiping out humanity. So obviously this is an extremely dangerous situation when both sides are developing nuclear weapons in the 1950s. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis that we're going to find out about today is all about that concern about nuclear weapons, and it all is about something that happens on the island of Cuba, which is located not far off the American coast, and the nearest state to Cuba is Florida, on the sort of southeastern tip of the United States of America. So that's what we're going to learn about today. So in this lesson, we're thinking about mutually assured destruction. I'm going to introduce you to a man called Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution, which began in 1959. We're going to find out about something called the Bay of Pigs invasion, which took place in 1961. And then we're going to learn about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which took place in 1962. So in the 1950s, the Cold War began to develop, and one of the things to be aware of is that although the Americans and the Soviet Union didn't fight each other directly, they did get involved in what was sometimes known as proxy wars. So that would mean that if there was a war in another country, the Americans would support one side and the Soviet Union, USSR, would support another. So, for example, in the Korean War, the USA had supported South Korea, whereas the USSR had supported North Korea. And this is pretty much what happened in the 1960s with the war in Vietnam, for example. And you see lots of these conflicts that are going on during this time. The other thing that happened in the 1950s is there was what was called an arms race. And if you look at the PowerPoint for this, you can watch some videos around this and have a look at that duck and cover safety advert that was introduced in America in the sort of post-World War II era. And you can see here that lots and lots of nuclear weapons were being developed, and they made what the nuclear weapon that had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in 1945. They made that bomb look relatively small, and of course we know from when we learned about that in class how much damage that nuclear bomb did. In 1961, the Soviet Union, USSR, actually tested a bomb which is called the Tsar bomber, which is the largest nuclear weapon that's ever been tested. Absolutely huge weapons that were being tested, and it's in that context that you have to understand the Cuban Missile Crisis. So why does Cuba become important? Well, this is a picture of Fidel Castro, and he led a communist revolution in Cuba in 1959. Now, this was a huge concern for the Americans because, as you can see on that map, Cuba is located very, very close to the United States of America. And the concern of the Americans was that if Cuba, well, it had become communist, it might ally then with the Soviet Union, that was also obviously communist, and the Soviet Union might be able to put nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba, which would threaten the United States of America with these what are called short-range nuclear missiles. So that's the concern. It's only 50 miles off the coast of Florida, Cuba. Also, the Americans had quite a lot of influence in Cuba. Many American people owned land in Cuba. They traded quite a lot with Cuba, particularly in terms of products like sugar, for example. So this was a big concern for Americans. So this is what happened during the revolution, and the American government was not particularly happy about what happened in Cuba. And in 1960, Fidel Castro, he made an agreement with the Soviet Union, and basically he agreed to sell lots of Cuban sugar to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union would also provide what's called economic aid. So they give money to Cuba, and they were also going to give weapons to Cuba as well. And this made the American president at the time, who was called Dwight Eisenhower, it made him very, very angry indeed. He reduced the sugar that the USA was buying from Cuba, and in October 1960, it banned all trade with Cuba, and the relations between America and Cuba became very, very strained. This guy in the top right, by the way, is Che Guevara. He was one of the leading military figures who brought about the revolution in Cuba in 1959. In the top left, you can see a picture there of Fidel Castro. So, in 1961, America got a new president, John F. Kennedy, and he was very concerned about Cuba. And when he became president, the CIA in America, which stands for the Central Intelligence Agency, had this plan to use what were called the Cuban exiles. So these were people that had been living in Cuba, but they'd been exiled. They'd been asked to leave the country when Fidel Castro took over. So the plan is that the Americans and the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, would train these Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and get rid of Fidel Castro. But the Americans themselves would almost pretend that they weren't actually involved in the invasion. It wasn't the Americans themselves that were doing it. So the Americans organized this invasion force of 1,400 Cuban exiles, and the plan was to land at a little bay on the coast of Cuba called the Bay of Pigs. And this would have been what's called a coup, an attempt to get rid of the government of Fidel Castro. But it failed, and it was a huge failure, and certainly a huge failure for Kennedy at the start of his presidency. The rebels didn't have much military experience. There were soldiers that were going to defend Cuba. And of course, the Americans were actually quite surprised because what they hadn't realized is that many ordinary Cubans liked Fidel Castro, and they wanted him to remain as the leader. So this Bay of Pigs invasion failed, and Castro survived as the communist leader of Cuba. So huge humiliation for Kennedy at the start of his presidency. And you can see here, there's a map of Cuba, and you can actually watch a video about it as well. But this is the Bay of Pigs where they landed. And of course, again, you can see from this map how close Cuba is to the United States. And this is why everyone in America is so worried. They're worried that nuclear weapons could be put on Cuba and used to attack the USA. So how did this all escalate? Well, in 1962, an American spy plane, a U-2 spy plane, took a photograph over Cuba. And this was a spy plane. And on that photo, and you can see that photo here, they found that the Russians were building nuclear missile bases on the island of Cuba, and this showed them that there was a concrete plan to put nuclear weapons on Cuba. So John F. Kennedy, who's the leader of America, and put him on a collision course with a Russian leader, Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev. And this photo was very dangerous and almost sparked a nuclear war, because Kennedy then found out that the Soviet Union had some ships that were coming across the Atlantic Ocean with these nuclear weapons on them, ready to actually house these nuclear weapons on Cuba and threaten the Americans. And obviously the Americans did not want nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. So this was very, very dangerous indeed. And you can see here that it was a little bit hypocritical of the Americans, because the Americans themselves, they actually had their own nuclear weapons on a missile base in Turkey. And you can see here that this was very, very close to the Soviet Union, to key cities like Moscow and Kiev, for example. So really, Khrushchev wanted really to have something similar to what the Americans had. But for Kennedy, this would have, again, been seen as a huge failure if the Soviet Union had got nuclear missiles on Cuba. And you can see here, this is why it's such a threat, that if these nuclear missiles were on Cuba, it would threaten all of these American cities. So with the medium-range ballistic missiles, with a 1,000-mile range, take out cities like Atlanta, Miami and Florida, for example. And then the sort of intermediate range missiles would take out cities like New York, Washington, D.C., even as far over in the west as Denver in Colorado, Dallas in Texas, and Chicago up there in the north, even as far as Boston. So this was very, very dangerous indeed. Khrushchev wanted these nuclear missiles on Cuba because it forged that link with Cuba. He also needed to look strong because the building of the Berlin Wall had been seen as a failure in his own country. And he wanted to test Kennedy, who was a young president, and some people said he was, quote, soft on communism. Kennedy, though, he needed to be tough he needed to prove himself as a leader. After the Bay of Pigs, he needed to prove himself. So we had this very dangerous situation with Cuba, where both the American leader, Kennedy, and the Soviet Union leader, Khrushchev, they both had to prove themselves and prove to the people in their respective countries how strong they actually were. And this is a cartoon which very much shows the tension at the time. Both men sitting on nuclear weapons, both men sort of wrestling with each other, both men with their fingers on the nuclear button. So this was one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. Probably, I would say, the most dangerous event on the Cold War. So Kennedy really had about 5 or 6 different options, really. He could do nothing. He could have invaded Cuba. He could have bombed the missile sites to destroy them on Cuba. He could have attacked the Soviet Union, maybe even had a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviet Union. He could have bombed the ships, or he could have put a blockade around Cuba. And it's interesting to think now what you would have done if you were Kennedy. So this just shows you what happened in what was called the so-called 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Kennedy called together his key advisors that were known as his executive committee, the ExComm, and he decided that it was too risky to bomb or attack Cuba because this could provoke a war, and he did want to avoid a war. Kennedy was a man that did want peace. So instead, he launched what was called a naval blockade around Cuba, and basically he put a blockade of American Navy ships to prevent the Soviet ships with the nuclear missiles from being able to reach the island of Cuba. Now, this all got very tense because by the 24th of October, the Soviet ships reached the blockade, and then the world kind of held its breath to see, well, what would happen? Would they fight each other? Would there be some kind of conflict? And in the end, the Soviet ships decided to turn around. The two sides began to talk to each other via telegrams. Very tense on the 27th of October. An American spy plane was actually shot down over Cuba. Many people in the American government were demanding decisive action. But in the end, after 13 days of conflict, Kennedy's brother Robert, he agreed to meet the Soviet ambassador. And in secret, the Americans promised to take their US missiles, their nuclear missiles, away from Turkey if Khrushchev promised not to put nuclear weapons on Cuba. It showed both of them, that both sides, how close they'd actually come to a nuclear conflict, and it probably shocked both sides. And it actually led, because it had been such a tense situation, led to a period where there was more peace in the Cold War during this time. And that era in the 1970s in the Cold War, which we'll look at in future lessons, is known as détente, which is a word which means understanding. So some of the consequences of Cuba, one of the things that was revealed in the Cuban Missile Crisis was that the communication between the two leaders wasn't very good. They were pretty much having to write messages to each other via telegram. So they set up a direct telephone line between the American capital and the Russian capital, so they could improve communication and talk to each other by phone in time of a crisis. And then they passed a series of other agreements, the Test Ban Treaty, signed by the American, Soviet Union, British, to ban the testing of nuclear weapons in various places, and also agreed to only use space for peaceful purposes. The 60s at the time of space exploration tried to reduce the spread of nuclear weapons as well. So there's a little film you can watch about the Cuban Missile Crisis there. This shows you some of the consequences of Cuba. Kennedy and Khrushchev talking about the threat of nuclear war and how that would be almost like a Pandora's box, that once it was let out, it would wreak lots of havoc and damage. So talking about, let's get a lock for this thing. So they were trying to improve the relationship between the two sides. So what I want you to do based on this lesson is take a knowledge quiz using one of the forms, and that just gives you a review of some of the things that we've learned about in the lesson. If you've got any questions or you're not sure about the Cuban Missile Crisis, then please let me know. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed that lesson about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thank you.